Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Catherine Winters-Michaud, the Program Manager at the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. We're using Zoom webinar for this afternoon's presentation. Please put any questions for our presenter in the Q&A, which you'll find on your toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you're experiencing technical issues, you can use the chat to contact the hosts, and we will do our best to help you. Please remember that we expect all participants to engage in respectful conduct during this virtual event. Any questions or comments, including those typed in the chat and the Q&A, should advance the discussion. We are all here to learn together. I would now like to introduce Dr. Kate DeConnick, Director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Kate?
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you to everybody who's joining us for today's webinar, or a kind of lunch and learn about the topic of what is genocide. So I'm going to speak very briefly just to introduce our speaker for today, and then I will hand the Zoom mic over to her to take things over. So Dr. Ashley Greene is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. She also coordinates our graduate programs, which we have another event coming up next month, which we'll mention at the end of the session today, if you're interested in that, to learn more about the grad program. But Dr. Greene holds a dual PhD in Peace Studies and History from the University of Notre Dame, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, where she specialized in transitional justice and 20th century East Africa. Her academic research focuses on genocide prevention, modern-day slavery, and education in conflict-afflicted societies. Her credentials are quite vast, and so I'm not going to go into all the specifics today, but she is widely published. She is an affiliate of the United Nations and UNESCO's different programs. And quite honestly, we're very lucky to have her here today to lead this discussion. So thank you for being with us, Dr. Greene, and I want to turn the Zoom mic over to you for your presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to the entire Cohen Center team for putting this together. And to everybody who's joining today on their lunch break, it's really a pleasure to be with you all. So for those who might be wondering what is in store for our time together, I'm going to be talking about 3 different areas. And I'm going to start by talking about the legal definition of genocide and the place that that definition occupies in the broader framework of international law. And the goal for that time will be to gain a sense of confidence in understanding what sets genocide apart from atrocity crimes like war crimes or crimes against humanity, and to understand how those legal determinations are made. The third thing that I'm going to talk about today is how to operationalize the definition of genocide. And by that, I mean, how do we apply the definition of genocide to cases of identity-based violence, not in a strict legal sense, but in a way that helps us see the patterns and the processes that are embedded in the crime of genocide. And my hope for that time is to leave you with tools and a conceptual framework that we can use when we observe cases of violence around the world. So let's start with definitions. Our legal definition of genocide comes from the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This convention was passed in December of 1948. It came into effect or into force in international law when it was ratified in January of 1951. And what you're looking at here on the screen is Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, which defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And below that, you can see the 5 criminal acts or categories of crimes that can constitute genocide: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions on the group that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. So this wording, what you're looking at here, provides the foundational elements of legal culpability within international law. So for human rights lawyers, the definition provided by the Genocide Convention and the precedent established by international courts and tribunals is really what determines whether a crime can be prosecuted as genocide in a court of law. Within the broader framework of international law, there are 4 crimes that now today fall under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. And in addition to genocide, those crimes are war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. So if you read through these definitions, I won't read them word for word, but you can see that war crimes focuses on violations of the laws or customs of war, violations of the Geneva Conventions, and these can include murder, enslavement or deportation of civilian populations, the use of child soldiers, mistreatment of prisoners of war, killing of hostages, and then destruction of cities and towns and territories that's not justified by military necessity. Crimes against humanity are acts that are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. And again, you have then a list of what that can include: murder, extermination, enslavement, and you can see other examples there as well. The crime of aggression, we're not going to speak about today in relation to genocide, but this is the use of armed force by a state against a sovereign state. And this would apply to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, one thing you might notice if you're looking at all of these crimes in a list or side by side is that there's actually a fair amount of overlap in terms of what can constitute each crime. So when we look at how to separate them, we have to look at something else, because obviously they can all include murder. They can all include enslavement, slavery. They can all include deportation. So what sets the crimes apart from one another are the contexts in which they're carried out, the scope of the crimes, and the legal parameters that are established by the definitions themselves. So war crimes, you can see there just underneath, is always going to be carried out during armed conflict, whereas crimes against humanity and genocide can be carried out during a conflict or during peacetime without the presence of an armed conflict. War crimes can be committed against a civilian population in an occupied territory, against prisoners of war, or even against enemy combatants. If, for example, we were looking at the use of a banned or prohibited weapon, like a biological gas. And those crimes can be prosecuted whether they're committed against a large number of people or if they're committed in a more targeted way against individuals. Crimes against humanity, however, has to be committed against a civilian population in either a systematic way or a widespread way. So when we look at crimes against humanity, we're really looking at large scale or very organized types of crimes. Now, when you get to genocide, you can see that while the criminal acts themselves, meaning the way or the means by which genocide can be carried out, are very similar, and in some cases the same as the acts that constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity, the law becomes much more narrow when we look at who exactly it applies to, who it protects, and when we look at the context in which the crimes are carried out. So to be tried as genocide by the International Criminal Court, the crimes outlined by Article 2 of the Convention have to target members of an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group because of their membership in that group and with the goal or the intent of destroying the collective existence of the group itself. And in terms of scope, the convention gives us this vague terminology in whole or in part, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment. But you can see that genocide is by far the most narrow, or the definition with the most legal parameters for who it protects and how the crime is carried out. And this is why in a case like Cambodia, for example, the violence perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s was tried differently in the hybrid tribunal for Cambodia, depending on the identity of the victim. So the killing of ethnic Vietnamese and Cham Muslims was recognized as genocide, while the deaths of ethnic Khmer who were by far the largest number of victims, and they were targeted based on social class, on political ideology, and they died from disastrous collectivized farming policies of the Khmer Rouge. Their deaths were tried as crimes against humanity. Now, when we're speaking from the perspective of international law, whether or not a crime constitutes genocide is something that's determined in a court of law. States that have been accused of atrocity crimes, including genocide, are tried by the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. And this is a permanent judicial organ of the United Nations that was established in 1945 to adjudicate disputes between states. Individuals accused of atrocity crimes can be tried by national courts, by tribunals that have been set up to deal with specific events, or by the International Criminal Court. And the ICC came into law in 2002 through the Rome Statute, and it was really set up to be a court of last resort. So it tries individuals when states are either unable or unwilling to do so themselves. And it can open a case in any country who's a party to the ICC, in a country who's accepted its jurisdiction and invited it to investigate an episode of violence. This happened in Uganda in relation to the conflict with the Lord's Resistance Army, or if it receives a referral from the United Nations Security Council. And when we look at the determinations of the international courts, we can see how rarely states and individuals are convicted of genocide. Since 1951, when the Genocide Convention was ratified under international law, only 3 cases of genocide have been recognized and tried in international courts. And those are the genocide against the Cham Muslim and ethnic Vietnamese by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and the 1995 massacre of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica. So the United Nations has recognized cases of genocide like the mass killing of the Yazidis by ISIS in Iraq, or the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. And we've seen arrest warrants issued by the ICC for the crime of genocide for individuals like Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. But very few cases go to trial for genocide at the international level. And this is in part because of the narrow legal definition established by the Genocide Convention, particularly when it comes to the limited number of identity groups that are protected and the burden of proof for establishing genocidal intent. And I'm going to come back to both of these things in just a moment. But oftentimes perpetrators will decide, or prosecutors, will decide to try a defendant for crimes against humanity or for war crimes because they feel they have a better chance of success. Or in some cases, defendants are offered plea deals where they plead guilty to one of those crimes in exchange for offering information about the crimes and about other possible defendants. So I want to leave our conversation about the legal determination of genocide there and move on to talk about how we can apply the term genocide to cases of identity-based violence within the social sciences. And the first thing to say about this is that our goals for the study of genocide are different than the goals of a human rights lawyer who's trying a state or an individual in a courtroom. When we study genocide, we're trying to understand the underlying causes. Why does genocide happen? And we're trying to understand the process of genocide. What are the patterns of escalation and de-escalation that help us predict when a genocide is going to take place and how it's most likely to progress and end? And for those of us who work in the area of atrocity prevention, the ultimate goal is to be able to identify and interrupt the process of genocide as early as possible. So what I'm going to share comes from the Edinburgh Brown Guidelines, which have come out of ongoing work by a team of mathematicians and social scientists who are developing legal guidelines for the Genocide Convention, similar to a set of guidelines that a team of scholars and lawyers developed for the legal definition of slavery a number of years ago. So the guidelines are based on legal precedent from case law and on existing scholarship in the field of genocide studies, but also on measurable variables that we can observe and test with empirical data-based methods. And I'm going to focus on 3 of the guidelines. The larger set has 10, And these three represent areas of the Genocide Convention that tend to cause the most confusion or debate. And those areas are the language of in whole or in part, the four protected identity groups, and the word intent. So in whole or in part, one of the challenges of applying the definition of genocide to cases that we're looking at that are in progress, meaning we're not in a courtroom when the violence has ended. We don't have all of the evidence sitting in front of us in folders, but we're trying to analyze what we're seeing play out in real time. One of the challenges of applying the definition is that some of the language is vague. What does it mean to try and destroy a group in whole or in part? Is in part 10 people, 10,000 people? What if a single person is murdered because of their membership within a targeted group? So the guidance that we have from case law is that genocide isn't about numbers. Genocidal acts do not have to be committed against every individual member of a target group for genocide to have occurred. And genocidal entities who attempt to destroy a target group, even in whole, don't have to be successful in order to be guilty of genocide. And in fact, we rarely, if ever, see a genocide that's completely successful in its objectives of destroying a people group. From a legal perspective, we're talking now about applying this. How should we understand in whole or in part? From a legal perspective, the numerical threshold in terms of how many people need to be killed for a case to be considered genocide is 0. And this is because of the crimes outlined by Article 2, which include serious physical or mental harm, the prevention of births, and the transfer of children from one group to another. And when these crimes are committed in order to destroy the collective existence of the group, this is genocide. And we have examples throughout history of how damaging these crimes can be to a group's existence and survival. During the Holocaust, for example, Nazis performed medical experiments on Jewish women and men, trying to perfect techniques that would sterilize them. And the torture that these people went through in these experiments alone, and the goal of preventing births for Jewish parents, would satisfy the criteria for serious physical and mental harm. But imagine that the Nazis weren't successful in this, but their hope was to create an injection that could be given to Jewish women without their knowledge at a doctor's appointment and effectively prevent them from having children. And the Nazis knew that if this worked, if they could sterilize a population and prevent the births of any future children, they would eliminate a people within a generation without a single body or violent death. And this is why it's so important to recognize rape, sexual violence, sex slavery, and biological absorption, and the forcible prevention of births as strategic tools that perpetrators use to commit genocide. Unfortunately, we have too many examples of this. Rape used as a strategic tool of genocide in Rwanda and Bosnia. Women forced into marriages and sexual relationships in Australia, in the Ottoman Empire, by ISIS in Iraq so that they would bear children perceived to carry the identity of the perpetrator group, and Rohingya women in Myanmar and Uyghur women in China given birth control injections and IUDs against their will. So this is just one example. We could also talk about residential schools and the forcible transfer of children who, after this terrible process, if they ever made it home to their families, couldn't speak to them. They couldn't speak their language anymore. We have other examples of this as well, but it shows us that there isn't a magic number that makes a case genocide. Now, when we are looking at a significant number of deaths or at mass killing and trying to figure out what does in part look like in this case, we do have guidance as to how we can understand in part. And this is that in part implies a significant number relative to the total of the group as a whole, or a significant subgroup, such as its leadership or another social segment selected for destruction. Now, this may mean that we're looking at a percentage of a group who has been killed. For example, in Germany's genocide of the Herero in German Southwest Africa, which began around 1904, nearly 65,000 Herero were killed. Now, 65,000 as a number is far below the millions that we sometimes tend to think about when we're talking about cases of genocide, but it represented 80% of the Herero population. It also might mean that we're seeing a targeted massacre of a subgroup of people, like the Ottoman Empire's attack on Armenian leaders in 1915, or gender-based massacres. And we often see massacres, for example, of adult men when we're looking at cases of genocide. Now, if you're looking at this third bullet point and you're thinking to yourself, okay, so what does a significant number mean? Well, a significant number means a substantial part of the target group, and it implies a part of the group of such numerical significance that the destruction or loss of that part would cause the destruction of the group as a viable entity, as a whole, or as such, within the nation or territory we're looking at. So this guidance helps us distinguish between cases of conflict or violence where we see a high number of casualties, and it helps us distinguish that from cases of genocide by looking not at the number of deaths, but at the impact on the survival of the target group. Now, when we talk about the protected identity groups, this is probably what has caused the fiercest debate surrounding the Genocide Convention, is the limited number of groups, identity groups that it protects. It lists 4: national, ethnical, racial, and religious. And this list was originally more expansive. Earlier drafts of the convention included political groups. They spoke about linguistic groups. But we have to remember that the process by which the convention was written was a political one, and it involved political compromise, it involved disagreement between the stakeholders, and a number of them had personal concerns of how this might apply to their own countries if groups like political groups were included by the convention. So in the end, these 4 were the only 4 that made it into the law. Now, amongst scholars, there is large-scale consensus at this point that when we're looking at genocide, it really can apply to any collective identity. And this is for a number of reasons. One is that there are obviously many collective identity groups that are not listed here. Political groups, social classes, gender groups are some of the most glaring omissions. The convention, as it's written, also fails to grapple with the complexity of identities and the reality of the way that identities overlap or intersect on the ground. So it doesn't map very well onto the way that people are targeted in real life and onto the way that perpetrators think about their victims and identify their own victims. So Adam Jones points out, for example, that genocidal targeting is always the result of blurring and a blending of identities. Victims, he says, may be simultaneously viewed as representatives of a dangerous ethnicity, as an insurgent social class, as a threatening political entity, or a malevolent gender group. And Jones reminds us that really, when we look at cases of genocide, especially cases that are ongoing, we have to remember that group identity is often something that's imposed, even if it's imagined or constructed, made up by the perpetrators, rather than identities that are claimed by their targets. And this horrifying reality has been experienced across time. It was experienced by farmers in the Soviet Ukraine who were executed or exiled to the Gulag after being told that they were kulaks. Which was a contested and abstract term that Lenin had used to apply to wealthier peasants, and that Stalin applied to whoever he wanted to remove. So it was experienced in Cambodia, again, by victims who were murdered because of their level of education or the use of eyeglasses made them the new people, a category of class enemies that the Khmer Rouge constructed. So it's important to remember that in the reality of modern times, the vast majority of people who are murdered in genocide are killed on the basis of a collective identity, even if it's one that's imputed by the killers. And this is poorly mapped out for us with the convention. So when we look at the Edinburgh Brown guidelines, what we've done is to identify variables that are indicative of target group selection. And these are variables that we can look at when we look at cases that are ongoing, cases of conflict or identity-based violence, and we can observe them and then use data-based methods to try and measure them. And some of these, for example, are, has a target group been classified based on real or perceived shared traits? Are they going through this process of classification? And we've seen this in genocides throughout time as people lose their identity documents or grouped in certain ways and then symbolized. The stamp of the J on Jewish passports by the Nazis. In Myanmar, Muslims have had their identity documents taken away and they've been classified as foreigners on the national censuses. Have genocidal entities articulated a logic of annihilation? Oftentimes when we look at the way that perpetrators or genocidal entities will try and justify their actions against a target group, it's through the articulation of a logic or a rationale that explains what makes them appropriate for extermination. And the most extreme version of this that we see is the articulation of an existential threat. The genocidal entity identifying a target group as an existential threat. Their very existence is something that poses a threat to the existence of the genocidal entity or the perpetrator group. And we've seen this in Myanmar, where the Tatmadaw military has increasingly over the years created propaganda and booklets that accuse Muslims of trying to take over the country and trying to marry Buddhist women and forcibly convert them to Islam. So this articulation is something that we're going to oftentimes see, if not always, when we see a genocide in process. And some of the variables, I haven't put all of them here, but you can just get a sense of it. Are there official or unofficial pronouncements? Are there campaigns? Have there been laws passed or characterizations in public media that portray the target group as appropriate for extermination and that sell this idea of an existential threat? Now, the last area of the convention that I want to look at before we open it up for questions is this issue of intent. Now, intent is central to the definition of genocide legally and for those of us in the social sciences. Genocide cannot be an accident. It must be committed on purpose. Prosecutors trying a person for the crime of genocide have to establish two things. First, that the person who's on trial meant to engage in one of the 5 acts listed in the convention, and second, that they did so as part of a purposeful attempt to destroy a target group. So this is called specific intent, and it really means that you have to show someone committed these acts in order to cause the precise consequence that resulted from their action, and this would be the destruction of the group in whole or in part. Now, this can provide, and one other thing I'm going to come back to later, this clause or the knowledge that the target group would be destroyed, I'm going to talk about in a moment. But the need to prove intent can present a real challenge to prosecutors, as you could imagine. People who commit genocide rarely give you that smoking gun. They're often using euphemisms, trying to hide their actions. It can be secretive. There can be a smoke screen of war or conflict masking what's happening to a specific target group. And the second challenge is that genocidal perpetrators are not always as organized as we tend to think that they are. Genocidal intent is something that can evolve over time or solidify in the wake of disastrous policies. So Michael Mann says, and I think this is helpful, he says, it's rare to find an evil genius plotting mass murder from the very beginning. Not even Hitler did so. More often, perpetrators' responses to perceived threats escalate and become more violent as their initial responses fail or meet with resistance. Genocide emerges as a plan C. And so when we think about the evolution of intent, we can imagine that it's difficult to see this happening in real time. If we're trying again to identify and interrupt the process of genocide as early as possible, what do we look for in a case of identity-based violence or in a conflict that can show us that there's some sort of intent to destroy present? Well, and here are some of the things we can look at. One, again, is a logic of annihilation present? Has that been put forward by a genocidal entity? And secondly, has coercive control been exercised over the target group? It's difficult to actually destroy a group unless you're controlling them first. So many times we see in the process of genocide a number of steps that take place in order to control the movements or the freedoms of the target group. And so when we're looking at these variables, we can look at, have members of the target group lost their freedom of movement? Have they lost full belonging, full rights and protections related to citizenships, as has happened to Muslims in Myanmar right now? Have they lost control over resources needed to sustain life? Have they lost the ability to reproduce, like Uyghur women in the detention centers in Xinjiang, China have? Have the genocidal entities committed the crimes identified by Article 2? So looking for these variables lets us look for process sooner than we would be able to do if we were trying a case of genocide in a court of law. And the final thing that I promised to come back to is this third phrase, with the knowledge that the target group would be destroyed. And what do we mean by that? Well, what we expect to see and what happens in the majority of cases is that a genocidal entity arrives at that intentional decision to destroy a group, and then we see an escalation of mass killing and violence. And remember, genocide's a process, so the application of coercive control could have been happening for years or even decades, but we would typically expect intent to formalize for perpetrators and then see them pursue the destruction of a target group. But sometimes this happens in a different way. It happens, you might say, backwards in a sense. And in those cases, it's important to remember that this mental aspect of coming to intent doesn't always happen before we see mass death or destruction of a group. Sometimes the destruction of a group comes first because of policies that are inherently genocidal, policies that are going to lead to the group's destruction, and then intent comes later. So in processes like this, we have to find a way to look for or to identify what Dirk Moses has called a genocidal moment. And this happens, I think Roger Smith, who's a political science, really says it best. He says, sometimes genocidal consequences precede or come before any conscious decisions to destroy innocent groups to satisfy one's aims. With the recognition of the consequences of one's acts, however, the issue is changed. To persist is to intend the death of a people. So in other words, when we're looking for this moment, when perpetrators recognize the consequences of their policies, they see the destruction of a group begin, they can respond in three ways. They can reverse or change those policies or take steps to try to mitigate the destruction being caused. They can do nothing, or they can escalate their policies. So for a very quick example, before we close, in Stalin's Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine, the man-made famine that killed approximately 5 million Soviet Ukrainians, it came in the 1930s, but when Stalin enacted policies of collectivized farming, his intention was the rapid industrialization of the USSR. It wasn't the destruction of the peasantry. He needed to control them in order for this policy to work. But in 1933, when Stalin responded to the famine and he was learning and confronted with the knowledge that 10,000 people were dying of starvation each day, while the Soviet Union held more than 3 million tons of grain in its reserve, He escalated his policies. He continued to export grain to purchase foreign machinery. He blocked humanitarian efforts to relieve famine. He even expended resources to arrest thousands of Soviet Ukrainians for cannibalism as desperation pushed them to eat their loved ones and their neighbors. And what matters for determining genocidal intent are not the initial goals of the policies or Stalin's motives for enacting them. Legally, motives are actually unimportant for determining whether or not a genocide has taken place. We care about them as social scientists, but legally, they aren't what matters. What matters is the fact that the destruction that Stalin's policy caused was a foreseeable outcome and could have been avoided by a change in policy. So this is where I'm going to leave us. I know it's a lot, and these 3 guidelines, I hope will just give you a clarity and a sense of confidence in what genocide means, how it's applied in a court of law, but then for all of the rest of us who aren't human rights lawyers, how can we look at the world around us and have a greater sense of confidence in what we're seeing take place? Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. That was fabulous. Very well laid out and thoughtful. And